Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Coolidge Conversation event, presented by the Coolidge Corner Theatre and also by the Brookline Booksmith. My name is Jake Mulligan. I'm the film section editor at DigBoston. Tonight, we'll be joined by Adam Nayman, who is the contributing editor to CinemaScope magazine, which I must say, I just got a. Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Coolidge Conversation event. Excuse me, my audio is stepping on myself. So anyway, tonight we are joined by Adam Nayman, who is a contributing editor to CinemaScope magazine, which I highly recommend subscribing to. I just did it myself. And he is also the author of a few books. This book really ties the room together about the films of the Coen brothers, and It Doesn't Suck about Showgirls, his latest book, and really incredible piece of career-wide critical analysis is Paul Thomas Anderson Masterworks, which is currently available via the Brookline Booksmith among plenty of other booksellers, and you can find a link for it in the description here. So with no further ado, let me introduce Adam Nayman. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I'm very happy to be here, live from a dingy basement in Toronto. Not upstairs. I'm doing this. This is from my subterranean lair for this one.
And I join you from my one-bedroom apartment in Alston, Brighton. And you know, that introduction makes me think I'd like to start somewhere. I recently wrote about Inherent Vice myself for DigBoston, the publication I write for here. And I got a message from a friend right after it happened. He said it without saying it that I had forgot to mention The Big Lebowski in my piece. And he asked me, do you think Inherent Vice would even exist without The Big Lebowski? So I think that's a great place to start talking tonight with someone who's written books on both Paul Thomas Anderson and the Coen brothers. Right. I don't know if the question was specific to Pynchon or to Paul Thomas Anderson, so I'll leave that up to you too. But I'm curious, is there an inherent vice without The Big Lebowski?
There's probably an inherent vice. Why should we imagine a world where one or the other doesn't exist? Why should we deny ourselves the pleasures of a good novel and two good movies? I think that when Inherent Vice came out, that not just Lebowski, but that postmodern Chandlerish tradition that it's in, also with Altman's Long Goodbye, maybe some of Steve Erickson's novels, like these things were invoked, right, as sort of part of Pynchon's creative matrix and Anderson's creative matrix via Pynchon. I think that the relationship between the movies it's a tiny bit overstated. I mean, I was talking about this with someone else, that one of the great things about The Big Lebowski is that if any other character is the protagonist, the movie takes 2 minutes. Someone who's a little more attuned or attentive or has a less digressive sensibility than the dude probably doesn't take so long to figure it out. The genius of Lebowski is it's quite a simple plot. It's just the main character keeps it from coming into focus. Inherent Vice is much more like something like The Big Sleep or The Maltese Falcon. I mean, it's nigh incomprehensible in the novel and in the movie. What's coherent about it are the ideas and the themes and the politics and the feelings, I think, come through very strongly. But it's not Doc's fault that he's confused, And I think the movie, in a way, is even more dispersed and mysterious than the novel. But I like both movies a lot. I think that the imaginative scope of Lebowski is, we're not comparing them, but the imaginative scope of Lebowski is really something. And I think that Inherent Vice it's not about it being lesser or not about it being inferior. I think some of the things Lebowski goes for and is about are maybe a little closer to my heart, but they'd make a fine double bill.
So I want to mention at this point, while we're getting started, I jumped in maybe a little too fast there. If anyone wants to leave any questions for us in the chat, please feel free. While we're waiting for any comments you might have, let me step back and for the second question, ask the obvious one. This is a Coolidge Conversation series. We're inviting people who've finished works recently or to come and pick films they've chosen. I know the book makes very clear, in a sense, that Phantom Thread, and I think also The Master are really important texts to you when it comes to Paul Thomas Anderson. So why choose for this conversation Inherent Vice? And what kind of things do you maybe think you'd like to say about it that maybe are in the book that you'd like to emphasize, or maybe that couldn't even make it into the book?
Well, I'm always interested, and this isn't to circle back too much to the Coens, but it's interesting where the comparative film for me here would be like No Country for Old Men, where you have filmmakers who've always had a kind of magpie postmodern sensibility, that idea of working with other texts in an unofficial way, sit down and do a proper adaptation. You know, the Coens only ever said they adapted Homer and Cormac McCarthy. And while Anderson has lots of literary and filmic references in his early movies, it's only There Will Be Blood and Inherent Vice that are technically adaptations. And realistically, There Will Be Blood is barely an adaptation of Upton Sinclair. Whatever that movie is and whatever excellence it has, it's not really as a translation of that novel Oil. You know, it's barely the same thing. Whereas Inherent Vice is very faithful to a point and quite well behaved. And I'm just interested in that question of a filmmaker, you know, moving from sort of borrowing to showing their work and citing their work, but also the way that at the time of making Inherent Vice, I think Anderson was developing this really original sensibility that The Master and certainly Phantom Thread display. And I'm interested in the tension between his reverence for the novel and not irreverence in a mocking way, but like his willingness to do other stuff. And I think that there's a kind of spectacular series of sequences towards the end in terms of their staging and in terms of their content, where in big and small ways he kind of finds his own path out of the book. I think he follows Pynchon into the book pretty faithfully, and I think he finds his way out of the book in some very unique ways. And I think they're worth talking about. And also, just, you know, it's a cool movie. I like it a lot. It's fun to talk about. It's very good.
Well, I want to circle back soon enough to that comment about it being well behaved, which I think is an extremely interesting description of the film that I think, you know, is very true in one sense, and I might disagree with in another. But let me step back again. I've dived into this maybe a little bit too head first. I'd like to take a second to explain to anyone who might be watching a bit about the book. So Adam's book, Masterworks, takes us through Paul Thomas Anderson, you know, his feature-length film specifically, although of course there is a section at the back dealing with the music video work and other works. And it's a non-chronological study. In fact, the films are arranged in the order they take place. So we begin with There Will Be Blood at the earlier half of the 20th century and proceed through the film The Master, which takes place shortly after World War II, and then to Inherent Vice and Boogie Nights and so on. And it's just such an incredibly rigorous piece of critical analysis that you've put together. And as if to prove that point, we can kind of start with the literal very first shot of Inherent Vice. I tell you genuinely, I love the way you unpack that very first image and its relation to the epigram of Pynchon's own novel. And I kind of want to start by asking you about that a little bit. You write specifically in the book, in the Inherent Vice chapter, of you know, this tendency of critics, I think ourselves included, to quote, map prose onto mise-en-scène. So working on this career-length study of Paul Thomas Anderson that someone else recently described very well as like auteurist / anti-auteurist, I'm curious, because we're talking about Inherent Vice, how is the approach different for this chapter where, you know, by your own words, it's the one real true adaptation, which, you know, in of itself kind of cuts against that auteurist lens that the book itself is both battling against and kind of studying?
Well, I mean, and again, we could, and I'm sure we could, because I know you could, because you're a knowledgeable fellow. I mean, we could talk about the different, not just iterations, but like understandings of, and the different like exploitations of what auteurism is, right? How is it written about? And then the way it's written about changes the way that people practice their filmmaking. All those 70s guys who don't need to be romanticized any further, but will be until the end of time, and we all do it. It's not just that they were auteurs, it's they'd read the literature on it. And I think in reading it, they started to fulfill that practice in a way where they want that kind of heroic, idiosyncratic direction that they admire, and then they come to fulfill. And then I think Anderson represents that practice several generations later of it being internalized as like, an auteur isn't a guy or a filmmaker who is inscribing phantom threads, let's say. It's people creating masterpieces out of whole cloth. It's the musical analogy is the singer-songwriter, right? You know, not the session musician or the interpreters. You have to write.
Scorsese terms, there is no need for Anderson to do any smuggling.
No, there's no need to do any smuggling, exactly. And that's the way he wanted it from his very first movie. So it's not this idea of the journeyman who, if you look carefully, has been planting, this stuff in the movies consciously or unconsciously. I mean, these movies are made in these filmmakers' image. And Anderson's image from a very early age, I say this affectionately, critically, and also I think just objectively, is just overbearing.
Mm.
Hard Eight is not an underbearing movie. That's a word that doesn't exist, but it's true. It's not, it's an overbearing movie. And even its smallness is very stated, And so I think that by the time you get to Inherent Vice, Anderson has always been feeling himself, I guess, as a talent and had things he wants to say and convey and feel. I think There Will Be Blood put him at a level where probably if you buy into the idea of believing your own hype, the hype was pretty believable, and the risks that he was taking are the self-conscious risks you get to take when it's actually more risks than if you're making a $200 million movie. If you're making a $200 million movie, there's no risk. The risk is being willing to be that kind of gun for hire, right? But when you're making a, however much it costs, 10, 15, $20 million adaptation of a Pynchon novel that's going to get an Oscar season release, that's just like, that's the good stuff for a guy like this. And that's the good stuff for his fan base. And so you want to look at the movie and you want to say, so what are the impulses in making this? Is it just to adapt Pynchon? No, because Pynchon's not a blank author to adapt. And even adapting Pynchon is a statement. So then what do you want to do? Does he want to replicate Pynchon? Does he want to wrestle with him? Does he want to contradict him? Does he want to answer him? Does he want to make this his own? And I think the answer is sort of multifaceted, but I do think the movie's pretty well behaved because it's not a radical adaptation. He's not doing what he did in There Will Be Blood with Upton Sinclair. With Upton Sinclair, he's like, I don't care about this. The politics, the socialism, the actual historical political context, he scoops it out rightly for the kind of movie he wants to make. But in Inherent Vice, there's a guy leaving a lot of it in, and it's interesting.
I've always been interested in it in terms of adaptation. As someone who's actually reading a lot of Pynchon around the time it came out, specifically this, Bleeding Edge, Lot 49, it really struck me how much he took out the cartoonishness of it. And that's why I'm so interested by that well-behaved comment, because for people who haven't read it, the book of Inherent Vice, deals, and we could have an argument over how literally, but we're talking about a book, with zombifications in it. And it has a much more, there's a whole trip to Vegas digression. And for me, it's not so much the fact that he elides the trip to Vegas, he elides the energy of those kind of scenes throughout the book. And it turns it into a much more personalized thing. You talk a lot in the book about how we are left both inside and outside of main characters in the last three Anderson movies, The Master and Inherent Vice and Phantom Thread. I think, in contrast to There Will Be Blood, where you describe, like an impenetrable protagonist. And for me, what really marks and makes these most recent three films very special is the way they kind of dance in and out of that zone. And I feel that a lot in Inherent Vice, to wrap it all back around, in terms of just how much of the socio-political context is also elided. You write in the book about how there's kind of an allegorical treatment of Vietnam. And to me, that almost brings the question up of it's interesting that there's not much of a touch of Vietnam in this film on a literal basis. The closest you get is maybe Coy yelling at Nixon.
Right. No, and I mean, the thing about the novel, as you say, in addition to being cartoony, it's quite abundant. So when I say he keeps a lot of it in, it's not all of it. And I think that what you were saying about well-behaved is an interesting little phrase to then keep trying to turn on its head a bit, because in some ways, the lack of cartooniness is another iteration of well-behaved. The same way with the Coens with No Country, they tamp the stuff down, and the little cartooniness that's in No Country really counts, right? Mm-hmm. You watch No Country and you're like, wow, they're really, really, really behaving themselves. Oh, look at Javier Bardem's haircut. And it's that's their little way of signaling, no, we're here. I mean, not that you would ever mistake the way the movie shot or edited for anyone else either, but it's that's their little touch. So I think that, but then you read the interviews with Anderson, and it's very not contradictory in a way where you're he doesn't know what he's talking about, but it's very strange where he's oh, I was watching all the Zucker brothers movies and reading the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and this movie is like a live action comic strip, and there's moments that connect to that, like when Martin Short is in the movie, or the wonderful almost comic book style panels where Doc's getting kicked around and supplicating himself before the LAPD. I mean, that stuff is almost like a cartoon or a pop-up book. But yeah, I mean, around the edges, the movie, and I'm sure this will be stuff we'll talk about more. It's very wistful and very kind of not graceful exactly, but it's kind of wistful and tender and light and sad in a lot of places too. And I think he's taking that out of Pynchon, but I think maybe he's leaning into it even more than that particular novel does. And I think it's the same way that with Oil, with Upton Sinclair, there's a feeling that he took from that book, this feverish will to sort of succeed and dominate, and this idea of ambition, and then he dramatizes it according to his own ideas. In Inherent Vice, I think he finds a way to dramatize it according to his own temperament as well, but I don't think he's inventing that. I think it is in the book.
Well, to jump back a second, honestly, the next thing I was going to bring up anyway was that, like cited influence of the Zaz films, like Cheech and Chong films, especially, because to me, it's not that stuff's not there. There's an element of it, and I actually thought specifically, I love that you mentioned Where's Waldo actually in a different context.
Yeah.
In this essay, but there's a Where's Waldo sense to the humor of this film, I think, in certain passages. I think specifically of the fact, and this kind of ties back to the conversation on adaptation, but in one of the first scenes, they're reading Marshmallow Pizza, which is a detail taken from the novel and then played out in a long shot, not really given an insert, actually very much underplayed right back to that well-behaved thing. But that's a very specific comic touch. And in that, I can see a little bit of Airplane, maybe. In that, I can see a little bit of Cheech and Chong. Same for the gag at Chick Planet with the opening door on a crotch, which actually comes direct, I think, from Up in Smoke. But the rest of the film's humor plays, I think, in a different register and gets to that wistfulness. You called this an achingly sad movie in another talk I just watched, which is probably not really the way we're talking about it right now, but I think is very true. So I kind of want to talk about the humor of this movie in relation to the humor of The Master and the humor of Phantom Thread and maybe the humor of like Airplane. But I would like to get into that. How, looking at them all in close succession, what were your thoughts on that?
On humor, I mean, working backwards, I mean, the great fun of Phantom Thread is the severity of it. And the severity of it both in counterpoint to the comedy, but also as like a source of comedy in and of itself, where like the severity of the movie is funny because these characters, if they didn't know they were in a movie, they have no self-perception. I mean, Reynolds Woodcock's like the least self-aware person.
If I can cut in for just like one brief second, you have an interview in your book where composer Johnny Greenwood describes the whole film as a, quote, piss take of Englishness, which is like one of those things I will never be able to get out of my head.
As a piss take of Englishness, and some might say, who is Paul Thomas Anderson as a valley guy to piss take Englishness? But I mean, that we can talk about that another time. Yeah. But like, so Phantom Thread, there's a certain severity, and in The Master, there's an ellipticism where you're kind of like, some people are just quite baffled or beguiled or kind of, weirded out by the way the movie is arranged and constructed and cause and effect relationship, which also kind of swallows humor up or is the source of the humor. You have a guy who lives his life as a series of kind of blackouts and repressions and isn't always necessarily in touch with his own impulses and can't always explain his own behavior. And that can be the stuff of tragedy, or that can be the stuff of psychodrama or of clinical, psychoanalysis, or it can be the stuff of comedy. Mm-hmm. And the movie is essentially an extended joke about a guy trying to get laid. And it's not actually that's particularly profound. It's that it's really quite banal. It's the lengths physically and spiritually to which he goes in order to achieve this within the movie that's so funny to me. Which
are so specific to their moment in time, I think.
Which are so specific to their moment in time. And also, as in all, I think, good, not, I was going to say something dumb like all good art, but like in a lot of good storytelling, the humor and the tragedy don't cancel each other out. Ideally, they can heighten each other. And, in the same way that There Will Be Blood is a deeply severe movie that makes all kinds of lists because it has I'm putting words in straw men's mouths. I don't know if anyone has actually said this thing, but like, because it's badass or because it's what the fuck, or it's, it's brutal. I mean, it has all those things that you can really clue into, especially in its masculinity, but it's a deeply funny movie.
Yeah.
And when you talk about underplaying a joke, I mean, if I had to choose the funniest things in Anderson's movies, one of them is after Daniel was humiliated in the Church of the Third Revelation, he walks over to Eli in the background and shakes his hand and says something to him, which at the end is revealed, where he says, I told you that I was going to eat you. I told you that I was going to kill you. But the way it's played in the background, he doesn't go in for a close-up on Paul Dano. The camera's kind of drifting back to join the crowd as Daniel's milling about with them. And Paul Dano's just standing there looking terrified. It's really funny. I was looking at that scene the other day because I was preparing to talk about something. I was just like, that's priceless physical comedy, like a comedy of blocking and camera movement. And so, I mean, the movies are always funny.
One thing that stood out to me, I got to warn you in advance, I'm not even sure this will lead to a question. But one thing that stood out about Inherent Vice specifically to me, and maybe it's because in the context of your book and in the context of it, the idea of adaptation, I was thinking of it like both for and against this auteurist lens. But, you know, it's really seems to me an actor's film as much as it's an author's film or a director's film. And you were talking just there about, like, you know, the blocking and stuff of it. And there's a lot of, you know, incredible composition, not to even mention comic blocking and Inherent Vice. But one thing I was thinking about and taking notes about watching it, you know, most recently was, you know, I think it's easy to pinpoint how much of an actor's film it is. And this is a cheap parlor game, but by imagining it being recast. And, you know, I believe it, you know, just was confirmed news at one point that the film was set to go with Robert Downey Jr. in the lead rather than Joaquin Phoenix. And that's a version of the film that I think you can very much imagine using the exact same dialogue as this version of the film uses. And it's and even the exact same blocking. And it's an entirely different sense of humor. There's
wouldn't it just be Kiss Kiss Bang Bang?
That's like the fear, I think. Right. You know, like, so to take it more seriously, not that you've done enough taking it.
It's interesting.
But you know, I was thinking in terms of Pynchon, you know, there's that idea, there's so much singing in the book. That's actually another thing if we're going to talk about adaptation. There's no songs in the Anderson version, which is another, you know, kind of iteration of being well behaved. But I could imagine Robert Downey playing that characteristic of Doc Sportello that sings a little bit of Frank Sinatra on the way out the door.
Right.
And that's
didn't he play the singing detective?
that might be over my head.
No, he was in the remake of the singing detective. No, you're right. I mean, Downey would have that jazzy showman quality. Mm-hmm. And Joaquin Phoenix is many things, but he's not a showman. Mm. He doesn't have a showbiz persona in any of his movies. I mean, that's why The Master's so fun, because Hoffman is playing Orson Welles, and Joaquin Phoenix is not. Right? He's the audience. He's not performative. So yeah, big contrast. I mean, Phoenix. I mean, I don't know what you or what the collective we think of Phoenix at this point, because Anderson is not responsible for Daniel Day-Lewis becoming what Daniel Day-Lewis has become, which is actor as event, where he's either got to play Abraham Lincoln or retire. And that's not a criticism of Day-Lewis. It's like, he can't just be a guy in a movie. There are some huge stars whose center of gravity can be off center a little bit, and they can actually just appear with other actors. They can play incidental characters. They can play secondary leads. Phoenix has now joined that Daniel Day-Lewis class of, like, the whole movie is him. Right? He is the event, and the movie is built around that. I mean, that's Joker, right? That's her. That's this recent part of Phoenix's life as an actor. And yet Inherent Vice is, I think, the closest we get to him fitting into an ensemble. He's the entry point to the movie, and he's the perspective of the movie, but he doesn't dominate it exactly. You know?
I swear it's Providence you bring this up, because the very next question I wanted to ask was I want to ask you specifically, how do you feel about, like, Inherent Vice as an ensemble film when compared to something like Boogie Nights or Magnolia? Because really briefly, I think that you just brought it up, so I can't help but burst in here, but that's a context I was thinking Inherent Vice is very rarely discussed in. And critically, it is a fairly discussed movie, but I'm just occurring to me, unless I'm overlooking a lot of stuff, that it's not often thought of as an ensemble film, perhaps because, you know, that kind of interior exterior play makes Joaquin Phoenix's Doc Sportello such the center of it.
Well, and that's he is, except that you have one of the interesting through lines in Anderson's work, and it comes through in different ways, but it's in Magnolia via the Amy Mann songs, and it's in Phantom Thread just via the script, is the idea of females telling his stories, or women being kind of the voice in a movie's head. So in a way, using Joanna Newsom the way he does gives her a certain authority or agency, but then she's also just pantomiming Pynchon, right? It's a way to keep the prose in the movie. So I think that's a mixed success in terms of giving that character autonomy and agency. Shasta gets at least one or two scenes where, if not controlling the movie, it's certainly about her as something more than Doc's contact. But I would say that in Boogie Nights and Magnolia, maybe to a fault, and I say to a fault not judgmentally, but he wants everyone to be a protagonist, you know? And in Boogie Nights especially, like, there's long passages in the movie where Cheadle is like the main character, where Julianne Moore is the main character. Inherent Vice, I think, is a true ensemble movie in that there's just lots of chances for actors to be funny and set the tone for individual scenes and be wonderful in particular exchanges without ever really changing the fact that it's Doc's story and Doc's point of view. Inherent Vice, if it gave too much subjectivity to these other characters, it wouldn't work. The Private Eye movie is always about the detective bouncing off other people, you know? But Magnolia, which just randomly I happened to be giving a talk about yesterday for a class I'm doing in Toronto, the students were all, you know, one of their big complaints about it, or one of the constant refrains, is like, how can you make a movie where everybody is the protagonist in a melodrama? And the answer is kind of self-answering. It's sort of a self-answering question. It's like, well, you can. That's what it looks like. For better, for worse, for love it, for hate it. You know, and I think that in Inherent Vice, he doesn't make that mistake. He doesn't push to give Benicio del Toro or Owen Wilson or Michael K. Williams, you know, enough agency to carry the movie. But they all register. And I think that some of the really wonderful stuff in the movie is Phoenix's interplay with certain actors who've gotten kind of boring in other movies, but he makes them fun again. He makes Owen Wilson fun. Reese Witherspoon is fun. Benicio del Toro, I should say, is never boring, and he's really fun in this. And again, not goes without saying, hopefully we'll talk about him, but gets a great performance out of Josh Brolin, who is, I think, one of the characters who's more interesting than he is in the book.
Yeah, this is a film that I'm fully in the tank for in a lot of different ways, so I feel like I should say this as a preface, but Brolin to me is the actor, and as much as I'm in the tank for this movie, there are performances and individual scene performances that I don't think carry off the language so well.
Me too.
But Brolin is someone who seems to get the joke at every moment of the film he's in, and a lot of times that kind of expands the film further. There are great phone calls between him and Joaquin Phoenix as Doc Sportello in this film that are, I think the value of those scenes are almost entirely in Brolin as Lieutenant Bigfoot Bjornson, just to clarify, in his facial reactions to himself are what's carrying along not just the scene, but kind of like the humorous tenets of the scene and what's setting up that framework. It's really, really incredible.
I think that when people are writing and, you know, zeitgeist criticism or trying to map socio-political moments onto movies or movies onto socio-political moments, it can be a mug's game or it can be a losing proposition. But I wonder if in this era where very correctly there's a lot of rhetoric about the depiction of cops and police work in movies, and then you narrow that into the locality of Los Angeles. There's a whole subgenre of LA cop movies or movies that historicize, let's say, police brutality. Catherine Bigelow's Detroit, which no one remembers exists, but which is a very interesting movie from a couple years ago. Everything This Summer. Inherent Vice's portrait of Bigfoot's really interesting because it doesn't spare his authoritarian awfulness. And I don't think it tries to humanize him in a way of turning him into a hero or a misunderstood figure, but it really kind of shows the emptiness and the void that gets channeled out into that behavior and the yearning to maybe be something else. And I don't think that Pynchon's plot is the same, and that Bigfoot is sort of like, they fucked me over, you know? But I think Anderson's interested in how that being fucked over feels. And he does something really rare, which is he takes a completely 2D cartoon concept of like a shitty civil rights, civil liberties busting cop. And by the end, he complicates them. And it's not just like the simple complication of like, oh my God, you know, pigs have feelings too. It's like that last scene that he contrives between the two of them, complicated, historically contextualized feelings too.
Mm-hmm.
This encounter, with the weed between the two of them.
Yeah. And I gotta say, just to like step back for a second, because that whole weed scene is something I don't even know how much time we have tonight. I think we both know we could both go for hours here tonight. But like, in terms of Bigfoot, I do think there's an element of it that comes from the text. And I don't say that in terms to argue like where the intentionality comes from, but I just think more in terms of, I was thinking about what you just said in terms of like the approach to cops today in media and art. While I was reading passages from Inherent Vice over the past few days, there's a lot in there about Pynchon writing as Doc, talking about almost romanticizing the idea of partnership within the LAPD. And I do think there's a humanistic edge to both like the original text and the film itself in terms of, and it really comes down to, I guess we're just talking spoilers all night tonight, so I hope everyone listening has seen the movie. But it comes down to the sex scene for me between Doc and Shasta, which it's really emphasized in the Pynchon novel, but I think it's totally clear in the film, kind of collapses the space between Doc's personality and the personalities of the people he maybe thinks he's working against. That sex scene is a conflict between the straight world and the hip world in a very real sense. And I think that's an even larger thing for Pynchon. Like we could have a whole discussion on like, BDSM undertones in Vineland that might clarify that scene a little bit to us. But I think it is all there in the text. There is like not an antagonism towards squareness, towards the straight life, towards even cops, but instead a kind of understanding that these are impulses within ourselves. And I do think how it engages with that is like incredibly fascinating and troublesome in all the right ways.
Well, fascinating and troublesome, and a scene that reckons with, to some extent, the kind of the dominant, penis-headed sexuality of a lot of Anderson's other movies, which I don't think has ever been completely unthinking. And even when it is, can be pretty funny. But, in that scene where she's sort of, and it's from the book, but the way that it's directed and the way she plays it, where she's sort of confronting him with what he wants from her, not what he tells people he wants, or maybe not even what he tells himself he wants, but what she knows he wants from her in this fantasy of rescuing her from these bad dudes is tied into the desire to be one of them, himself. And it's all about possessiveness, and it's all about ownership, and it's all about kind of wanting to have her on his own terms, and his terms are not hers. She talks about the brainwashed Manson chick sort of thing as a sort of turn on, right? And in that moment, a lot of the things that in the light of day or in a sober waking way he would probably say he disidentifies with about the cops, about the Golden Fang, about power, are things that are pretty appealing to him. And the movie is filled, I mean, to make a Cohen's joke, the movie is dialectical. I will say I will never forget seeing Hail Caesar, and when the Herbert Marcuse characters are saying about dialectics, this guy got up with the girlfriend. He's like, "That's it, I'm walking out." It's like, I love the idea of someone walking out of a movie because the dialectic was mentioned. But in Inherent Vice, it's always either or. And then, as in good movies, the either or are kind of one and the same, right? This is an interest of mine, is in movies that challenge that Fitzgeraldian assertion about a fine mind holding two ideas at the same time. And what's kind of cool about Doc is he doesn't have such a fine mind because he's stoned all the time. But in a way, by being stoned, it's not that he holds the two ideas in mind, but like he's kind of indecisive. And if you map that indecision onto a moral compass, or if you map that indecision onto historical, a historical framework that Inherent Vice is working with, it's a pretty nuanced movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in that regard, I think where a lot of the nuance comes from, to step back yet again to the idea of like the ensemble, I was thinking a lot, watching it recently again, about how it achieves this like very particularly literary quality of suggesting whole subcultures in like single moments.
Yeah.
And like, I think I already mentioned Coy yelling at Nixon. I think that's one that almost suggests all of Vietnam in its little suggestion of like the combination between TV aesthetics and performative anti-authoritarianism that might as well be like the stateside reaction to Vietnam in microcosm. And there's other stuff like I adore how the film deals with bikers, which is more fleshed out in the text of the novel, and in the film they just kind of become a couple jackets faced away from camera with the patches suggested. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. Like you have a great quote in the book, which I wish I could pull up and quote right now. In fact, I can. You were writing, I think in this case, about the master. I'm sorry to do this to you. But you write that it trusts or perhaps challenges its audience to be cognizant of a social, historical, and political context that exists in the margins of its judiciously chosen images. That to me is such like a key explanation of especially the last four films, but Anderson's films in general. So I guess this whole winding talk about the suggestion of subcultures and that quote, maybe you could unpack for us a little bit, just like the socio-political context of where this is coming from, because I feel like that's something we're talking around and maybe not diving fully into.
Well, I mean, but that's the way you put it is what the movie does. It doesn't just talk around it; it walks around it because Doc is mobile, right? And this is something that if I was more academically inclined or smarter, because other people have written about this, there's a lot of writing on just the idea of mobility in the detective film. That that one of the features of modernist literature is the idea of experiencing the city. This idea of the person moves through the city and they experience culture and architecture and society sort of as an explorer. And Doc kind of, because he's not affiliated with anybody, because he's not a cop, but he's not, really a dealer or a crook, and he's not a rich guy, and he's white, but he's friends with with black guys. He kind of moves around. Mm-hmm. And because he moves around, he accesses different parts of the city's geography and its architecture and its class structure. And, he also has this agility that matches the Golden Fang, because the point of the movie is the Golden Fang is everywhere. And Doc isn't everywhere. He's just one man, but he can kind of go anywhere. And the horror is that he keeps encountering these emissaries of conspiracy everywhere he goes, and that's also a condition of being paranoid. Are you actually meeting freaky, scary people, or does everybody seem freaky and scary when you're stoned out of your mind? But I just like the idea that the Golden Fang is conceived in very exoticized Orientalist terms, in a way that invokes Vietnam, not just Vietnam, but invokes the home front fear of communism, then in its third smash decade following the 50s and 60s, to get to the beginning of the 70s, it's still what Nixon was running on. Still the problem that he was claiming that he alone could solve, to use a proto-Trumpian formulation. And so the idea of Doc as a sort of objector, pacifist, anti-war guy, not even to the point where the dude is, funniest line in Lebowski is when he says, "I wrote the original Port Huron statement, not the diluted version." I think the diluted
second draft,
the compromised second draft, would actually just be the Aaron Sorkin Chicago 7 movie, but
yes,
I don't want to talk about that. But no, Doc is a weird de-enlisted or enlisted man in the battle against this spreading specter, except of course it's the specter of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes both the most admirable thing you can say about a movie, but also like the most low-calorie, lame shit you can say is like, oh, the movie's anti-capitalist. I don't think Inherent Vice is necessarily anti-capitalist. I think it manifests and figures capitalism as a threatening presence in a very interesting way, which by the end of the movie is pretty persuasive. And when you talk about socio-political context, the movie begins and ends in 1970s. But if there is a more 80s image than the mom and the kid in the station wagon picking up the heroin and Doc just saying as small talk, it's the funniest thing in the movie. He's like, so how is it working for the Golden Fang? As a confrontation with evil, it's so banal, and it's such a great flip of the war on drugs. Like, it's hilarious.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say you write beautifully about that moment as a representation of kind of like the Reagan era war on drugs. But for me, and this is a related subject, but it's also you writing that kind of unlocked for me that like, oh, it's also a bit of a moment about the transference of who is using drugs in America.
Sure.
You know, like the late '60s counterculture, we are gonna literally pass off the heroin and the opioids to the suburbs, and you know, there's not much of us even here left to use it, so it's on you now.
Well, and the drug culture becoming corporatized is even more insidious, right? It doesn't make it safer. It makes it more expensive, and more racialized in terms of who's victimized and exploited by it. And I mean that's where I think the theme of corruption of a subculture or a counterculture, that's where Anderson meets Pynchon head on. Because in that sense, it's the most like Boogie Nights.
Yeah.
Right? Where
Absolutely.
you have this evocation of this hedonistic paradise where, yes, some people play too hard, and yes, some people get hurt, but they're doing it on these terms that are sort of culturally utopian. And then in Boogie Nights, in a way that's very simplistic, but also very effective in the pummeling way that Boogie Nights is effective, the 80s happen, and it's like everything that was good is bad. And I mean, again, it's not to denigrate Boogie Nights. It's just that's the dialectic of that movie, right? Is 70s good, 80s bad.
Right. And we got a question in the comments I want to get to in a second, but just to wrap up this thread, that's absolutely something I was thinking of that was really key, like just as a way of getting into this. And I guess really what I'm trying to get at in the first place is the idea that what I find so beautiful about some of Anderson's more recent films is that for as much as they're dead ahead with narrative intentions and quote unquote meaning, there's also it's more surface than subtext, at least more than might appear. Like I was thinking about that recently watching the film Hopper Wells, which depicts a meeting between Dennis Hopper and Orson Welles, because in that film, Dennis Hopper relates a visit from federal agents that is almost beat for beat, right down to the accusation of talking to black militants, the COINTELPRO scene from Inherent Vice, where if you've seen the movie, a few federal agents come and speak to Doc Sportello. And it just occurred to me how much we could glom meaning onto a lot of this stuff, but it's also experiential. There's also just like a ground level humanism to it in terms of these are actually the connections that were occurring in that moment in time. It's very specifically, and in a way, this almost connects to you talking about it not being an anti-capitalist. I do not think the film is kind of tied down by meaning in that way. It's more about it's a portrait of the subcultures that are occurring at the time, at the intersections of the subcultures that are occurring at that time, and the kind of interior reflections that maybe that provokes, but it's not really trying to activate us for or against anything. I don't think there are references to communism and certainly a very sympathetic eye towards that cause, but I don't think this book is going to convert anyone, and certainly that is part of its intention in the first place. That's not what it's doing.
Well, I would just say before you get to, again, maybe the question is about this, but I just while we have this thought in mind, then we can go to whatever the person wanted to ask is, if the movie has a meaning, I don't think too much in terms of meaning as theme or feeling. And I think its theme or feeling is something that's not apolitical, but it's not strictly political, which is just loss, right?
Yeah.
And you can argue that it's an insular narcissistic idea of loss, that to graft an entire era onto the idea of someone who misses his girlfriend is kind of the height of solipsism. And I don't know if the movie would necessarily disagree with that, because I think Doc is shown in his way to be quite solipsistic. Part of the movie is about the fact that he's cocooned himself in this kind of, addictive, this addictive lifestyle, which sort of prohibits him in some ways from reckoning with his own problems or really solving them. He keeps thinking that if he can find this girl, he's going to find and sort out everything else and straighten out the morality of the world. But the title of the book is all about the idea that nothing holds and lasts. So people are fallible, and if people are fallible, their feelings are fallible. And if feelings seem infallible, or if feelings seem better than experience, you're probably wrong. That's probably fallible too. And the only things that are perfect are memories, which is why the journey through the past sequence is so beautiful. Yes, it is a somewhat stylized, hippified, almost you could argue insidiously that Forrest Gump or The Big Chill are it's a packaging of an experience. It's to be young and stoned, and by the way, skinny and white, in, you know, LA in 1970 while it's raining, you know. I mean, it's pretty perfumey. But I think as people watch it, you feel something of your own experience, even if it's not that experience. And then when he comes around the corner and the Golden Fang Tower is there, it's funny and it's cartoony and it's ominous and it's scary, but it's also, who hasn't had that experience? Not just they paved paradise and put up a parking lot, but like, I was in this place before. And I'm never going to have that moment again. Even if I'm living with the things or the person or the life that I had when I was in that moment, it's gone. You know, to cite the great deflated lefty filmmaker of our time, and that's Kelly Reichardt. It's not about her being better than Anderson or worse. She's a different kind of filmmaker. But her movies all operate according to the principle of Old Joy. The title Old Joy and the title Inherent Vice, they mean the same thing. I think they mean the same thing, and they're also about mortality. You move forwards, you know. Moving backwards is just sad, and that's where Inherent Vice, I think, has its real power.
On that note, let me jump to the question. As much as I want to sit here and talk about like even down to the camera setup of that journey through the past sequence, and the whole concept of camera setups in this film, that's another thing I spend all today thinking of. Is like, I don't know, I gotta say to anyone watching this, if you're a fan of Inherent Vice and you happen to have it on home video, there are a selection of deleted scenes that typically have second and third and fourth camera setups and angles of all the scenes. And it seems so key to me that none of those are in the final product, because it gives the film this quality of like a snapshot. And that's what I was thinking of while you're talking about like sharing in the emotions of it. It's almost given to us in such an ephemeral way without coverage. Just from I remember a friend of mine, Peter Labouze, at one point compared it to a Hong Sang-soo film. And it does have that idea of just like one small angle of an event, of a conversation viewed from a camera that's just kind of slowly zooming in on it.
Anyway. Especially the conversation in the fog. I love the idea of a shot getting closer and closer to two people while they remain obscured. It's typically the purpose of a zoom or a push-in is to clarify something or to give you more and more of what people are looking and feeling. I love the idea of pushing into the fog. Is just such a witty visual idea.
On that note, I know we got 9, so I'm jumping straight to the questions. We get them in. The two we have are kind of related, so I hope I'm going to start with the right one. But let's start with the first one. I'm just going to quote it directly. Do you think there's something of a depiction of ugliness in his Doc's engagement with Shasta in that sex scene? That's kind of like his reaction to the context that owns his desire, that he resents, that, you know, he resents the desire he's having for her in that scene. And what does that mean for the quote unquote resolve there in that scene and in the film, if there even is a resolve, is the question.
I mean, I think that scene is ugly, and it's interesting how the bodies are not shown in any kind of pleasurable way. They're really fragmented, right? Like you have her eyes, but you know, her face is in the foreground and he's in the background. I mean, it's not that the way that they're having sex is ugly or unpleasant, but their bodies aren't really displayed in any kind of nice way. They're not making eye contact with each other. It's fragmented. It's a really sort of uncomfortable bit of blocking, and it's very performative, right? But they don't seem to be performing for each other. It's like they're each in their own little private performance, and you can't really access Doc's pleasure. Like it feels, and this is like, there's a nasty way to put it, but like it feels like a bit of a hate fuck, even though there's a lot of love in it, you know?
Well, I'll just point out, like, one thing that really stuck out to me once again on this viewing was, you know, her reference to Mickey Wolfman, the character she was most recently, you know, having sex with, as an inconsiderate lover. In the way her actions in the scene are essentially, you know, pointed towards turning Doc into that same inconsiderate lover, which of course has to be in him to be let out in the first place. But yeah,
which has to be in him to be let out in the first place. And you know, whether this is satisfying for her to expose her white knight as being tarnished or deeply disappointing, you know, who knows? The movie's not quite from her point of view, so we don't know. But in terms of what it does for the resolution to the person's question, I'm really interested in the fact that in that final scene, she is now the presence that Joanna Newsom as Sortilege was, which is sort of, she's just there, but she's not saying anything. And in the novel, and you've read it more recently than me, and since I put this in the book, I hope I'm not wrong, and pretty sure I'm not wrong because I wouldn't have let myself be wrong. But the whole point of the end of the novel is Doc is alone.
Yes. Yeah.
And in that final scene,
In that fog, it's the same car ride, but he is alone. Yeah.
And so I love the idea that Anderson directs that last scene so that that's not necessarily not true. Because at the end of The Master, there's that incredible cut from the physically embodied woman who he's with, Wynne Manchester, to the woman on the beach who's not real.
Yeah.
And in a way, Shasta's been with him for the whole movie. She's been the structuring absent. She's been by his side. She just hasn't really been there. And that last shot is very ambivalent for me. I don't mean in a kind of like YouTube explainer way where it's like, don't you see, you know, she's not there. She doesn't cast a shadow. She doesn't have a reflection. I just mean that in that scene, they're together, but he's alone. There are a couple.
This is, I think, so key to the recent work in a general sense. And you've outlined like really well how it's kind of established by the Master and its aesthetic play. And then I think there's almost a mirror of it in Inherent Vice and Phantom Thread. These are both stories told by women in the very first shot of the film. And then we are asked to take, you know, at our own level, the reality of what follows. We know that even within the reality of the film, we are being told stories. And yeah, I think, you know, like absolutely Shasta is kind of a stand-in for sort of Liege in that last scene, which I have to mention since, you know, talking about adaptation, it's always cracked me up. Unless I'm misremembering, and I also don't think I am, in the novel, Doc's listening to God Only Knows in that last scene. So it has a needle drop that Anderson had already used, and there's a certain, you know, talk about providence, there's a providence to that as well, I think.
Yeah, it's funny when you mention the needle drop of God Only Knows and Boogie Nights, because isn't it interesting that after all the horrible 80s mixtape music that Alfred Molina is playing, which is also tied into that movie's themes about analog and digital, because what makes him such an asshole is that he won't listen to an album. He's like, I don't want to listen to a record, I want to tape my thing. But after these horrible 80s songs, what do we
specifically ties it to like disrespecting artists' wishes. Like, I don't want to listen to what the artist tells me to do.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that the refuge in Boogie Nights is the late 60s? It's Pet Sounds, it's Brian Wilson, it's this sort of return, you know? Except, you know, if you think Boogie Nights is a bad movie, then you think that it's doing that literally. And if you think the ending is satirical, then maybe Anderson's having a bit of a laugh with that. But we don't have to go down that rabbit hole now.
No, I don't think we have time to. But certainly, I think it's interesting in regards to kind of the tonal conversation we've been having, you know, that Boogie Nights is kind of this big cinema scope. I almost think of like old Hollywood epics in relation to Boogie Nights, and it does have that kind of simplified morality to it. I do think that same nostalgia, the idea of the Beach Boys as a return to paradise, I think that same nostalgia is there in Inherent Vice, but it's certainly viewed with a much more complicated lens, which hopefully we've gotten at a bit tonight. The next question, maybe we can relate it in a sense to nostalgia. I think it's definitely related to nostalgia. Someone just asked, is for the Coolidge in Brookline? Most definitely the Coolidge Corner Theatre in Brookline. So going back, question is, would it be appropriate to say something about Fiona Apple's presence in the film? And can you say something about Ex-Old Ladies? And before I throw to Adam, I'll just say Adam did an excellent talk at the New Republic. If you search the New Republic on YouTube, with figures including Miriam Bale, who had, you know, they talked a little bit about Fiona Apple's presence in the film and the idea of Ex-Old Ladies. So after this ends, if you want to throw over to there, you can maybe get a bit more information. But on that note, Adam, Fiona Apple in Inherent Vice.
I mean, I'm so hesitant because I don't know these people, but of course none of us do. And that's the thing about famous people, right? You know, and I'm not pious about extracurriculars, you know, I mean, when you're dealing with famous directors and famous actors and famous relationships, and if you can sort of be, you know, there's autobiography in movies in a good way, there can be autobiography in movies in a difficult way. And I know that I'd written my book already when Fiona Apple was doing the press run for her new record this year, but I must have had at least 15 people message me being like, you know, it's too bad you can't include that anecdote about her feeling locked into a screening room with Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson, you know, while they're being coked up asshole boys arguing about movies. And I'm like, yeah, that's not flattering, right? You know, I think that probably in the same way that any filmmaker is filtering aspects of their own romantic and emotional life through romantic and emotional entanglements in their films, consciously or not, I don't doubt that if this is a serious relationship in this filmmaker's life, that Fiona Apple comes to bear on it. And the presence of Joanna Newsom, not as the girlfriend, but as sort of the friend figure, someone who is not just Fiona Apple too, that's disrespectful to both singers, but someone who's in the same, let's say, kind of pocket of music and maybe the same pocket of fandom is interesting. But I think that I'm more persuaded by Phantom Thread as a meditation on a specific marriage than I am by Inherent Vice as a movie made in the image of his, missing Fiona Apple, just because I think the novel's already pretty strong on that point. So if he's putting himself into that and that informs the movie's depiction of it, then that maybe accounts for why it's strong or why it aches or why it's painful, but it's not coming from him. Phantom Thread as an original script, there I think that some of that movie's ambivalences and ultimate kind of love for marriage and monogamy in a weird way, I think is very revealing. Or maybe I'm just following the crumbs that he's laid out in interviews where he's talked about Inherent Vice being a bit less personal and Phantom Thread being hugely more so. So maybe I'm just falling for it.
Yeah, we could have a whole conversation about that. You have a great touch in the book where you talk about, Anderson kind of doing critics' work for them in regards to Phantom Thread with his kind of oft-told story of getting sick. And I think there's a definite truth to that, because in a way, I think it almost clouds a lot of what that movie accomplishes, which is maybe a more generalist perspective. For me, when I think of Phantom Thread, and I'm starting a new conversation just as we're running out of time for it, but when I think of Phantom Thread, I never think of the mushrooms, the poisoning. I always think of Reynolds Woodcock sitting at home alone on New Year's Eve. To me, it always strikes me as a film about why would you go out again if you think you've gotten what you want from this thing you have.
Well, and I'll only answer that to say that in a movie filled with images I love, I think in Phantom Thread, the image I may love the most is him stalking through the mezzanine of the Royal Albert Hall, while life and progress and change and the knowledge that you can only go forward is down on the floor. I mean, right down to the rocket ship that's been pulled onto the dance floor. It's like everyone there is celebrating the idea that life goes on and he does not want to leave the house. And there's a comedy to that and a sadness to it about the one-way direction of life. And that's what I mean, not trying to be morbid or death tinged about everything. But when Anderson's movies access that idea that simultaneously the knowledge that nothing lasts and the idea that when you try and go backwards, you're not really doing anything but fantasizing or dreaming, they're pretty sad movies and humane to me in a way that some other filmmakers of comparable talent and stature don't always allow themselves to be because they're too cool. I think PTA has gotten way, way better the less cool he seems. Maybe I'm just grafting my own washed dadness onto that, but
no, I was thinking even, you quote him in the book talking about Magnolia being referenceless, and of course you cut against that because it's not exactly true. But It's actually something that I was thinking about in terms of Inherent Vice. That is the sort of thing he takes out. He takes out Doc watching Godzilla movies on the bed. The movie itself is not referenceless. In fact, you unpack a lot of the reference, like the Freak Brothers, very well. But there is a sense that it's unmoored from coolness, which I think is what we're talking about.
I think it is unmoored from coolness, and I think that the coolness by the last few scenes is gone. Those last few scenes, whatever else is going on in them, they are stripped of reference, they are stripped of iconography, or they're creating their own iconography, like that drug exchange, which is pretty vividly him. It's not described that way in the book. It's not done quite that way. So,
well, Adam, it's 9:00. I feel like we're just getting started. I could talk all night. We haven't even gotten into Eyes Wide Shut yet, which I feel like hangs over your book in a sense like a cloud, and which I'm suddenly thinking about in relation to Inherent Vice a lot. Before I ask like a last question, let me mention again for anyone watching this, Adam's book, Paul Thomas Anderson Masterworks, is available everywhere, including at the Brookline Booksmith, which we encourage you to check it out for. We've been having this conversation courtesy, the Coolidge Corner Theatre based in Brookline, which you can support at coolidge.org. And we thank them as always for hosting us. And to leave this off, Adam, let me just ask you, you've written this book on Inherent Vice. You've been working critically since well before it was released. So I'm curious how your perspective has changed as someone who kind of was covering this film and thinking about it on release, and and now someone who's kind of had to return to it, not just return to it from a critical perspective, but returning to it as someone who's, spoken to its editor and spoken to a lot of the creative personages involved in its making. I'm curious just how your perspective on the film has changed.
I have always been, remain so, and will continue to be quite fond of it, and probably would say that of all the movies I wrote about in the book, it was the one that I was the most anxious in a weird way about getting not right. I mean, it's always arrogant when critics say I'm going to write the definitive piece on something and get it right. I don't believe in that, but get it kind of right for me, because The Master is a movie, and this is a weird way to put it because that's a strange movie. I got that film, and I got it the first time I watched it, and I didn't need to work through it. It doesn't mean I'm right about it. I just mean for me, I got it. And Phantom Thread, the first time I watched it, for me, it clicked. This one didn't misfire. I liked it from the beginning, but I felt like I kind of had to work for this one. I had to work for, how am I going to fold this into my thesis? How good do I really think it is? How interested am I in Pynchon? How interested am I in any of this? Not that I'm disinterested, but how interested am I? And this was one of those times where I kind of had to make the movie click for myself instead of it just clicking for me. It's a weird thing to say about The Master because I know people find it an enervating, strange movie, but that was actually the first time ever seeing one of his movies. And he's one of those filmmakers, given our similar ages, I saw everything in the theater when it came out, right? Starting as a teen. The Master, even after There Will Be Blood, was the first time with him where I sat in the theater and like, I get this totally, and I'm with this 1,000%. It's a weird movie of his to feel that way about, maybe, but it'll always be the one for me that made the most sense on impact. So with Inherent Vice, I feel like I had to dig a little bit more.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Adam, for your time and for your book.
Thank you. What a lovely chat. I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a great pleasure for me to have the conversation, and even more so to kind of parse through this book. So I sincerely encourage everyone listening, however many may be left, to please check it out and enjoy it.
However many may be left.